He abruptly grabbed my arm and began to throw me on the bed. I started calling for help, but they were in cahoots. Real memories of a girl from the front. I remember how closer to spring, when it got a little warmer, a friend stopped by one of our platoon commanders. He was supposedly on his way to the front, but he immediately seemed suspicious to me. I thought he might be a deserter who had found his friend and decided to stay with him for a couple of days. In the evening, the lieutenant brought him to the kitchen after everyone had had dinner. He asked me to feed them both, dividing his portion into two. I set the table for them. They sat down and ate. The lieutenant finished quickly and left the dugout, but his friend was delayed for some reason. I started to clear the table, collected the dishes, and began to heat the water in the wash basin. I just went to the table to pick up the last plates, when suddenly this man abruptly grabbed my arm and pulled me towards him, trying to push me onto the bunk. At the same time, he also blew on the lamp on the table and the light went out. For a moment I was numb with shock and fear, but she quickly came to her senses and began to scream loudly, "The sentry! Help me!" There was only silence in response. I screamed even louder with all my might. And then it was not the sentry who came down into the dugout, but the same lieutenant. Let's go back for a moment to the beginning of our heroine's story. On Sunday afternoon, June 22, 1941, the collective farmers of the Srednjaktuba district of the Stalingrad region were working on vegetable plantations when the news of the outbreak of war reached them. Among those who worked was Anastasia Ivanovna Kulikova, whose life, like the lives of millions of Soviet citizens, changed overnight. The Kulikov family was immediately affected by the war. Anastasia's two older brothers, who had recently served and returned to the collective farm, were immediately drafted into the army. Both of them died at the front. The third brother, who had been serving in the Navy for the 5th year instead of returning home, was forced to continue his service, returning only in the autumn of 1945. Anastasia Ivanovna herself received a summons in October 1942. On October 14th, she arrived at the district military enlistment office in the Middle Aktuba, where the draft commission was held in the school building. After a medical examination, about 50 healthy women, both girls and married, were selected for service. They were sent to the 87th Separate Service Company, subordinate to the 93rd Army Base under the 2nd Guards Army. Throughout the war, the company followed the army, providing its logistical support. For the first time after the draft, the girls continued to wear their home clothes, which created many problems with the onset of cold weather. The huge size 45 English boots and windings given to them could hardly be called suitable equipment. This led to an ingenious solution. The girls turned the windings into homemade stockings, which caused concern to their platoon commander, 2nd Lieutenant Natalia Ivanovna Grivenko. The company in which Anastasia Ivanovna served was divided into squads of 12 people, under the overall command of Captain Alexandrov. It is noteworthy that at first they were not given any weapons. It was only in December, when the company was sent to Stalingrad, that the women finally received full-fledged uniforms and rifles. They were dressed in warm uniforms, quilted cotton trousers and sweatshirts, hats with ear flaps. However, the transition to military life also required personal sacrifices. All the girls had to cut their heads like boys. At first, the female recruits continued to wear their civilian clothes, including summer shoes, which created serious problems with the onset of cold weather. The only shoes issued were huge size 45 English boots with windings. In this very uniform, the girls even took the military oath. The resourcefulness and practicality of the girls manifested themselves in their improvisation with windings. They turned them into homemade stockings by cutting and sewing them on one side. This creative approach caused concern to their platoon commander, 2nd Lieutenant Natalia Ivanovna Grivenko, who feared the disapproval of her superiors. The company in which Anastasia Ivanovna served was organized into 12-person squads under the overall leadership of Captain Alexandrov. It is noteworthy that at the initial stage of the service, women were not given weapons. The situation changed only in December when the company was sent to Stalingrad. Then the women received full uniforms including warm clothes and rifles. The transition to military life ended with a haircut for a boy, which all the girls went through. Anastasia's duties included cooking for 7 officers. The menu for each day was prepared by a female military doctor, carefully planning the diet. Breakfast was always light, tea with a sandwich, while lunch and dinner were more substantial. In the evening, Anastasia received food for the next day, cooked according to the prescribed menu, and washed the dishes after the meal. All these actions took place in a cramped dugout that served as a kitchen, dining room, and sleeping quarters at the same time. The furnishings were Spartan: a cot against the wall, a table, a bench, and several stools. 2 entrances and exits provided the necessary air circulation in this small space. When all the officers gathered for a meal, the dugout became extremely crowded. Anastasia's story pays special attention to the process of water extraction. Despite the fact that German troops were already surrounded in Stalingrad, the danger of air raids persisted. Therefore, they went to the Don shore for water mainly at night, fearing possible attacks by German aircraft. I remember how, closer to spring, when it got a little warmer, a friend stopped by one of our platoon commanders. He was supposedly on his way to the front, but he immediately seemed suspicious to me. I thought he might be a deserter who had found his friend and decided to stay with him for a couple of days. In the evening, the lieutenant brought him to the kitchen after everyone had had dinner. He asked me to feed them both, dividing his portion into 2. I set the table for them. They sat down and ate. The lieutenant finished quickly and left the dugout, but his friend was delayed for some reason. I started to clear the table, collected the dishes, and began to heat the water in the wash basin. I just went to the table to pick up the last plates, when suddenly this man abruptly grabbed my arm and pulled me towards him, trying to push me onto the bunk. At the same time, he also blew on the lamp on the table, and the light went out. For a moment, I was numb with shock and fear, but she quickly came to her senses and began to scream loudly, "The sentry! Help me!" There was only silence in response. I screamed even louder, with all my might. And then it was not the sentry who came down into the dugout, but the same lieutenant. When the lieutenant returned to the dugout and asked, "What happened here?" and the light went out, I couldn't help myself. She attacked him with the words, "And you're asking what happened? Agreed, dogs. No, it won't work. I'll report everything to the company commander. If you want to go to the penal battalion, then you will get it." After that, the lieutenant quickly grabbed his friend and took him away. The train arrived early the next morning. The whole platoon, including that lieutenant, went to unload, and his friend stayed, still asleep. I went out into the yard and suddenly saw him trying to get into the grocery warehouse. He had a small claw hammer in his hands with which he had already torn off one board. Without wasting a second, I called the sentry. He came running and commanded the intruder, "Get up!" But he did not even think to obey. The sentry repeated his demand twice more. Suddenly, the intruder jumped up and tried to run away. The sentry fired, and I saw the fugitive roll off the cliff right into the river. Not far from the scene of the incident, a huge pipe was dug into the ground where all the water from the river went. The sentry looked down and said, "I see it surfaced," and he was swept into this pipe by the current. After that, he returned to his post to continue guard duty. When the lieutenant returned from unloading the wagons, he was at a loss. His friend had disappeared, but his belongings remained. He asked if anyone had seen the missing man. The sentry and I decided to keep silent about the attempted entry into the warehouse and that the intruder had been shot. It was a difficult situation, but we understood that the truth could lead to even more problems. After the victory in the Battle of Stalingrad, our 87th Maintenance Company began to move. We began to move westward after the advancing troops. Our service was closely connected with railway stations. We worked as a link between the front and the rear. We unloaded the arriving trains and then reloaded everything into the cars coming from the front. So following the 2nd Guards Army, we went a long way through Latvia and Poland, reaching Königsberg itself. There was only one car in our company, so we followed the army by rail. Unloading trains was hard work, and we were not given any equipment to help. They did everything with their own hands. Shells, ammunition, provisions. They carried everything themselves. And there was no difference between men and women. They just put us in the wagons and we started working. I remember how if the car was standing on a high embankment and we couldn't reach its edge, they would install a wooden ladder for us. We used it to get into the car, bent down slightly, and a box was placed on our shoulders. Then it was necessary to carefully go down. I was backing up this ladder with a box on my shoulders, and all the time I was thinking, just don't fall. At first, after unloading, everything hurt. We walked like unfinished. But over time, they got used to it, got involved, and nothing hurt anymore. And how could we not get used to it if we had such unloading every day? There were also tragic cases. One day, almost an entire platoon died. 12 people. More precisely, one person survived. He was a non-drinker. And the other 11 were poisoned to death. They found some alcohol and drank it, not knowing that it was technical. It was a terrible reminder of how dangerous carelessness can be, even in the rear. German planes often flew into our railway stations, but in all 3 years of my service, there has never been a direct hit of a bomb into an unloaded train. It seemed that the German pilot was aiming accurately, but the bomb always flew somewhere far away. We considered it a real miracle and our luck. After each unloading, we returned to our dugouts and immediately started washing. Our uniforms were always heavily soiled, and we tried to keep them clean. I remember how our tunics turned completely white from constant work in the sun and frequent washing. It was a strange sight, as if we were wearing some kind of special burnt-out uniform. Despite the hard work, we also had moments of relaxation. One fighter from the men's platoon had an accordion. Every evening after dinner, the men came to visit us. We danced and sang to the accordion. These were precious moments when we could forget about the war a little and feel like ordinary young people. But the fun didn't last long. Usually, after an hour, the attendant would command, "Finish it." Everyone come out to check it out. The men were leaving, and we girls were forming up, and the platoon commander was checking if everything was in place. After the verification, everyone went to bed to gain strength before the new working day.